Welcome back to the For All the Sakes podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have with me Mark Vernon on the show. Mark, I've been so excited to have you on and to discuss the topic we're discussing. I've been really looking forward to it, so thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, look, thanks for having me on, and it's good talking about these things. The conversation brings these things to life, so I do appreciate the work that you do, and hope we can communicate some of that now.
Yes, and I'm going to apologize from the off that, well, being an interviewer, I get the grace of being the stupidest person in the room, and I certainly am, but I'm looking forward to learning a lot more about William Blake than I already know, which is not very much. So maybe, I don't know, for those listeners that we have who may not be familiar with William Blake, they've probably heard Jerusalem hymn or, different quotes from William Blake and poems, but who was William Blake?
Yeah, he's the kind of person that probably almost everybody's heard something of him, even if they're not quite sure that it was him. So the hymn, "To see a world in a grain of sand," the dark satanic mills, these are phrases that have almost become everyday use in the language. But he is a Georgian figure. So he's born in 1757 and he dies in 1827. So this is the time of war in Europe. England and France often at war. The American Revolutions in his lifetime, the French Revolutions in his lifetime. So it's a very turbulent period, but it's also one of great expansion, particularly in London, where he lives, where I am now. The benefits of empire coming to a city that quadruples in size. George III is the King of England. When Blake, for most of Blake's life, Mad King George, as he's known now. And so you can think of it as this time of great sort of optimism, interest at a global scale. Ideas from India coming into London, ideas from the Americas coming into London, but also sort of turbulence and trouble. But historians increasingly think of it now as the period in which the modern mentality really bedded down. And so Blake, I think, can be a prophet for our times because he saw many of the assumptions and the worldview, that's now just the air we breathe. He saw it coming and so can help us offer a kind of spiritual analysis, I think, of our times, for good and for ill, which is, why I've wanted to write about him and why he's drawn me.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I see just behind you the great book cover that we were just talking about, how beautiful it is, and very clearly awake. And what are you hoping people that will awake to after reading it?
I mean, the quick answer is knowledge of God, and in particular, what Blake called the human form divine, which is the divine light awareness within us, but not just within us, but then within the whole of the natural world too, the cosmos itself. And so the awakening in Blake is the realization of that, the invitation that he has to grow in a participation of that sense of the spirit around and about. And he thought that that was coming undone in his time for various reasons we can dive into, and leads to a lot of the troubles of our times. So one of the things I'm really trying to do in the Blake is say, look, this guy is a Christian figure. He's a very sharp thinker and also a kind of Christian mystic. And those two elements, if you ever read anything about Blake, they're often the ones that get pushed to the sidelines. He's celebrated as a great creative, or he's celebrated for his poetry. But I think that we need to grapple with Blake afresh because he's got things to say about on the religious side, but also on the philosophical side as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that. I'm really excited to dive into those things. And one of the big themes of the book and of William Blake's teachings, I guess, would you call it teachings, is the importance of imagination. And well, could you take us through what exactly he means by that, and the importance of imagination and why it's different to just daydreaming or what we might commonly see as imagination?
Yeah, you're right. He lives at the time when this idea that imagination might be just kind of my possession, your possession. If you're an artist, you have sort of more of it than most, but that somehow we conjure up fantasy, imagination, dreaming, ideas in our private minds. And, that's now become the default assumption, really. But Blake says no. He at one point he says nature is imagination itself, and he sees the whole of creation as the outpouring, the emanation is the word he often uses, of the divine imagination. That's what creation is for him. So when you look at a tree, you see the wisdom of God, the intelligence of living being as a tree. When you look at the sky, you feel the expanse of eternity as well as the mundane shell, as he called it. And when we human beings, seem to have this extra capacity to become directly aware of this ourselves. And so the invitation in Blake is to become more aligned to that great flow of imagination that's all around us so that we can become co-creators with it.
That's really interesting. So it's a way of seeing, not just what we would think of imagination in almost a modern definition of it. It's almost a lens through which you can look at everything in life.
I mean, in a way, it is the way that we look at life. We're very inclined to think that we receive sense perceptions, say, like data comes through your eyes and you see images, or sound waves come through your ears and you hear certain things and so on, as if we're almost like machines receiving these impressions, which incidentally was an idea that was developed just before Blake's time with this great important British philosopher called John Locke. But Blake's pushing against that very much and saying, no, the senses, color, taste, sounds, and so on, they're like thresholds, they're like portals that invite us into a deeper sharing with the world around us. And the way that you extend into that inside of the whole world, and it can be connected with the inside of your world, if you like, is through the imagination. It has to be discerned, it has to be tested, it has to be developed. And, the artist does that, the prophet does that, the scientist does that as well. Blake absolutely is clear that modern science is a deeply imaginative undertaking, but that uses, say, mathematics in order to develop that imaginative reception. The religious figure, I don't know, if they're a prophet, they may receive inspiration, but then they have to do something with it. We always have to be active in terms of what we receive. By their fruits you shall know them, and all that. So, the imagination, it's not just a nice to have for those who are that way inclined. It is the way that we're already immersed in this great flood of meaning. What Blake can help us with is really make something of that so that we become more active and conscious in the sharing of it, and don't just dismiss what we receive through inspiration, through intuition, as if it's just a kind of private fantasy.
And how does innocence and experience relate or help us do this? Because this was an interesting part of what you were writing with Blake that I was kind of I was trying to wrap my head around in saying, we would see innocence as kind of a stage of life that's more linked to childhood rather than like imagination, this kind of way that we do see. And I don't, there was a great kind of sentence in the book, or well, more than a sentence, but it was a theme of, can you have innocence without being naive and be able to kind of see the world in that way, and can you have wisdom without being cynical? And I thought, I was just struck by that. I was thinking a lot about that question, and how does that link to what you were saying about imagination and how we can reclaim imagination?
There's a nice way that Blake summarizes it, which is, he says, imagine innocence always dwells with wisdom and never with ignorance. So innocence always dwells with wisdom and never with ignorance. And what he's saying, I think, is that there's a kind of openness or vulnerability, a kind of receptive capacity that we need in order to know ourselves, know others, know the natural world, know God. And we often ascribe that to kids, to young people, because they have that spirit of inquiry and curiosity. It hasn't
Mm-hmm.
been sort of educated out of them. But Blake would say, actually, that's just a kind of training for the adult innocence, which can be open, but can be wise too. It can sort of say yes to life, rather than hiding behind defenses and shells, and what he called single vision and Newton's sleep. So he feels that we must always keep our innocence alive, even as it becomes wiser and wiser. Because otherwise, we just end up living in a sort of small world, a world of our own making, that we've built up through our experience, say through our perhaps difficult experiences as much as our positive ones, or out of the sense of wanting to be safe and secure, which is a good thing. But if you go for that too much, then you end up living in a small world. And so innocence is this kind of openness. I mean, I was helped very much in this because I work as a psychotherapist as well as writing.
Mm.
And a very important British psychotherapist, a chap called Donald Winnicott, and he's quite famous for the way he wrote about play and playing. And one of his best remarks on it is that the child practices play for when they become an adult. And the point about adult play is it's able to sort of have one foot in what you know, but one foot in what you don't know. And if you can pull that off, then your world expands and grows. You neither want to sort of dive only into what you do know, because that's like hiding under the duvet all day long. It's not going to be much of a life. Nor do you want to just run into the outer reaches of what's unknown, because you'll just get bemused by it or deluded by it or hurt by it. There's a kind of art to this innocence that Blake encourages us, where we're bringing all we are and all we have, but we're also open to what we don't know. So we grow and grow and grow in life.
That's really interesting. So, how does that? And this is a big question. Is this is a faith podcast, and how does this help us specifically with our faith, with our Christian faith, and our relationship with Christ?
Well, Blake's very interested too in that, in how we finite creatures might relate, say, to the infinite, or how we temporal creatures might relate to the eternal, how we mortal creatures might relate to the immortal. And although we are finite, mortal, and temporal, we have within us this soul or spirit, this sense and taste for the infinite. And so growing into more and more of the divine, of God, is, I mean, I believe this too, actually, but certainly Blake felt that it is the Christian calling. That's what the invitation is. We're destined for God, Blake felt. But the question is, do you want to collaborate with that? How does that happen? That's the excitement of life for him. And so, innocence and wisdom and play and so on are not just in terms of, I don't know, learning a new hobby or reading a new book or enjoying the outside, the world outside, or being with your children. I mean, all these ways in which our life grows. That they're all, in a way, all reflections of our growing life into God, into the who's infinite. And so this growth will go on forever and ever. It begins now and continues in eternity, Blake felt.
Could you teach us then more about following on from that? About you mentioned before about us almost taking the roles of co-creators in a sense, or what is the importance then of us taking time on Earth to create? Because I'm really passionate about this. And I'm no philosopher at all, but I just remember a few years ago thinking I really need to have something in my life where I'm creating something, not something digitally necessarily, because we can ascribe lots of different titles to what we do digitally. But at the end of the day, I'm still at my desk typing on a box on a metal machine. But something where I don't know, I take something just material around and I turn it into something and see a reward and end point. And I often used to think, well, if I'm trying to be like God and emulate his attributes and all of that, then surely creation is one of the most important things. But I didn't know if I was just being silly or overthinking that. But what I'm learning from you is actually no, that really is important.
I completely agree. And actually, I've just come, before we were speaking, from an afternoon with a chap here in London who recreates William Blake's images, like the one behind me, from the copper plates that Blake originally made. And by putting ink on the copper plates and then putting them into a printing press, making reproductions of Blake's images. And I thought I'd sign up for it. It's a fun thing to do. I'd learn a bit more about the printing process and so on. I went with it rather mind in my head sort of thing. But actually, what really happened was that it quite moved me, because you realise that like copper and ink aren't just materials, but they have a kind of character. they sort of work and move in a certain kind of way, and they relate to each other in a certain kind of way. And you have to collaborate with them in order to make a good enough job. Otherwise it's going to be just a bit of a mess. And so I think that this kind of creativity, and there's many different kinds of creativity, of course, but this particular one is one that strikes me because I don't tend to work, with materials in that way. I too work at a computer writing and so on, but it's very wonderful to I know, and the colours as well, the way the colours move and relate. There's a soul in everything. I think you discover through this creativity, and there as many manifestations of the divine as well. So I think Blake, would have us rediscover how everything's alive. Everything is a reflection of the divine spirit. And often we realize that by working with these things. I mean, people will know this through, say, gardening, or if they do have an amateur hobby as an artist, or if they're musicians, the amazing thing of singing together, where these vibrations that come out of us join with everyone else, and harmony, and tunes, and it connects with us emotionally and spiritually. I mean, it's the sort of exploration of this co-creativity, that it's good for us. People will often remark about how it has all these benefits from mental health, which I've no doubt is true, actually. But also it can be part of our vocation. It's part of the growth of our soul and our faith to do these things. Even a seemingly humble plate thing like I've learned this afternoon, like just dabbing sort of ink on a plate, it's alive as well. It's amazing.
That was really profound. Something that you said there, that Blake would have us see that everything has a soul, and that all these things are manifestations of the divine. That was really powerful. That's one to write down in my notebook afterwards. I loved that. Now, turning tack slightly, you mentioned harmony there as you were talking about the choir, and it sparked my mind onto a part of the book that I found interesting about contraries, and Blake's view of contraries. I think a line from the book, which was really a great way of putting it, was that without contraries, there's no progression, and that Blake almost viewed that there was divine energy in tension and not harmony. And I wonder, could you explain to us and teach us how these contraries can actually help deepen a Christian faith today?
Yeah, I mean, harmony often works through tension, of course, and the release of tension and the building up of tension. But yeah, I think the analog that might be helpful is, Blake lives in the Georgian period, and one of the most exciting sciences of the times was electromagnetism. So he's a contemporary of figures like Michael Faraday, the great British experimental scientist who discovered a lot about electromagnetism. And if you think of a magnet has a north and a south pole, and those two poles are kind of in, well, we talk about their polar opposites, and they're contraries, but it's their existence that creates the magnetic field and the energy that's held in the magnetic field. And if you think, I'm a North Pole kind of person, I only want the North Pole, and so you cut off the North Pole of a bar magnet. Of course, you don't get the North Pole on its own. You get a new magnet with a North and a South Pole. So Blake's also saying these kind of contraries are part of life, certainly mortal life. And they might be the contraries of like love and hate, or imagination and reason. He talks about all sorts of different contraries, but there's also, I think, the contraries of the human and the divine. I just was talking about the finite and the infinite, and we live therefore in these kind of fields that are held by contraries. And Blake's saying, don't try and resolve too quickly those contraries, as if you prefer one over the other. There's something about the transcendent being known immanently in what he called the minute particulars. That these fields of meaning, we can discover that way through the energy of the contraries. I mean, he reflects a lot on the image of Christ on the cross, and Christ stretching out his hands, what he calls the beams of love, and reflecting both the beams of the cross, but also the love beaming from Christ. And in the Christian sense, this is the extraordinary contrary, really, that it's in the death of Christ that we see the love of God, and these great mysteries that, rather than trying to resolve them, if we keep them open, then they just keep giving more and more to us. They keep inspiring us, and so contraries and progression is Blake's way of saying, um, stay open to what might seem even the polar opposites in life, like living and dying, and that will reveal more and more of the mystery of life to you. Um, it's that's maybe slightly highfalutin way of putting it, but it's also just saying, if you know yourself at all, you'll know that you have inside you love, but then you also have anger or jealousy or even hate at times. You'll know that inside you maybe have a preference for the rational, perhaps, but you have a secret yearning for the imaginative, or maybe the other way around. You are a bit of a daydreamer, but you need to be a bit more grounded. So this is just what it is to be human at one level. But Blake's saying, don't let that trouble you. This is what makes us human and can open us and lead us into these greater perceptions of life. Again, I get this quite often from psychotherapy, actually, because when someone comes to you in psychotherapy, they maybe have had a bit of behavioral help, CBT, something like that, which enables them to get through the day, manage things a bit better. But they want to know, what's going on? What's going on more deeply here? Why do I experience things in this way? What happened? And the way to do that is not to try and resolve things too fast, but keep this open innocence held by the seeming contradictions of a life. And sure enough, that will take you somewhere.
I certainly agree with that, and I hadn't thought of it that way. And I guess when you do think about it a bit more, I'm trying to grasp it more because it's something certainly that you don't pick up on straight away. But that if there was no, if all I had was love, then and all that everyone had was love, then there almost wouldn't be as much value to love because there's no contrast. There's no contrary to it. So it's yeah, that's really interesting to me thinking about that. And I guess does that link that kind of Blake's view of hold on, don't be so quick to resolve it and focus that first. Appreciate that. Is that why he has kind of an unorthodox view on progress? And um, actually, you almost describe him in the book as being suspicious of progress. Um, is that kind of why he was, or was it something different?
Yeah, I mean, he holds on to the contraries of modern life, which is, on the one hand, we want to feel materially secure, but if you put all your efforts in life to bolstering your material security, by going for the ever higher paid job for the sake of the pay, for example, you're going to probably realize at some point you're missing out on life, which you might call the spiritual element, the relationships and so on, that aren't done for pay. In fact, precisely the opposite. If someone said, I'll pay you to be my father, there'll be something rather offensive and strange about that. Blake's saying, progress. We need to. He's born in the time when progress, in terms of the material development of the economy, for example, he's near contemporary of Adam Smith, and is becoming more and more discussed. It's a mercantile age, but the cash economy is growing. Consumer is beginning to be born, and Blake is realizing that there's a true spirit in that desire to want to have more. But if all that desire gets focused on the accumulation of material things, he says more is the cry of a mistaken soul in that case. Because, he says, nothing less than all will satisfy us. But that all can't be found by the accumulation of material things. It must be found by the appreciation, the participation in spiritual things as well. Be that relationships, be that the creativity. And so that's the kind of progress he's talking to. When nowadays we use progress, we might mean material progress, we might mean moral progress. But Blake's saying, no, don't forget that this direction of travel is into God. And if that's not the primary way we're progressing in life, then we're really missing out on something.
Yeah, that's very interesting because that really speaks to me about my view of today, and that we've refined and optimized and advanced so much in society, and yet here we are with the kind of well, increasing mental health and all of these things. It's like, what did we miss? Because we're really advanced, and I guess this is the ideal time to usher in the famous "Dark Satanic Mills" quote from Jerusalem, which is a great hymn. Um, but yeah, the Dark Satanic Mills. Obviously, Blake lived during this first kind of industrial revolution in the United Kingdom, and much of what he was saying then and almost prophesying and warning us about seems increasingly relevant today. What do you think William Blake would say about today's kind of constant distractions and algorithms and screens? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just make a comment about the dark satanic mills because it is a very fascinating phrase. Because whilst he does live during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, he didn't really see the massive expansion of steam engines and mills and whatever across the English countryside, which came more in the Victorian period. But he realised that there was a kind of mentality unfolding. And so Dark Satanic Mills isn't just a description of what might be happening outside your window. It's as much a kind of worldview that's forming inside you as well. So satanic for Blake means that kind of closed, opaque, narrowing vision. He has this sense of the devil and evil, which is actually quite mainstream in Christianity before Milton, which was that, like in Dante's Divine Comedy, Satan in the floor of hell is actually on a frozen lake, hardly able to move at all. And so the satanic in Blake is always a kind of closing down of things. And the dark and the satanic, therefore, make us feel that the whole of life might be like a great mill, just sort of turning over like cogs within cogs, not with much meaning, with great power, great utility, sort of producing things, but increasingly not knowing why we're producing all these things. And he's very clear that this kind of technology really it's first imagined inside us, and then we kind of prepare the world for its reception. I mean, a parallel I think that's quite useful here. If you think about cars, automobiles, very very useful piece of technology, and incredibly efficient at getting us from A to B. But you need roads for cars to be any use at all. If you remove the roads, the car would be no use at all. And Blake feels that all of technology is like that. We kind of prepare the environment inwardly and outwardly, and then the technology can kind of flow in. But the risk is that then the technology rather takes over. And I think that would be his analysis of where we are now. To come back to the main thrust of your question, that have we reached a kind of tipping point where we're in the service of the technology more than the technology's in our service, and because the world has formed to such an extent, that it increasingly suits the kind of bureaucratization of processes. It increasingly suits the digitization of everything. It increasingly suits that which is more transactional and instrumental and so on, rather than spirited and soulful. Technology can always be put to spirited and soulful purposes. I mean, I hope that's kind of what we're doing now in a way. But nonetheless, we've got to be constantly aware of how the kind of seduction, I use this word in my book, the misenchantment of
Hmm.
technology. Its dazzle can confuse us as well as make us wonder. And if we're not careful, we kind of lose our sense of what it is to be human in the midst of all this. We're told the technology is going to take over. We've sort of got no choice. There's a great sort of wave of it coming, or there's some sort of tipping point where the AI is going to suddenly wake up. Each day almost in the headlines, there's a different kind of possibility here.
Yeah.
And I think what Blake would say, look, don't worry so much about what might happen. Ask yourself, who are you now? Stay in touch with your humanity now. And then that will actually shape the future and what comes.
Yeah, that's really profound because it he says in there that he almost describes Earth as like a spiritual cavern that's very beautiful but disconnected. And again, talking back then when we would say we probably feel like it's more disconnected now than it was then. So, are there, speaking of awakening and that, are there actionable ways that you would recommend that we could start reclaiming our imagination and start, because I I bet when people listen to this, like me, they would feel enthused to say, yes, it's about time I did something about this for myself, and thought about that for myself and my own life, to make sure that I'm not missing the mark. Um, and yeah, are there ways that we can begin? What would you recommend in reclaiming imagination in terms of what Blake advises?
Yeah, the heart of it, I think, is trusting that your imaginative life, your inner life, that which you feel drawn towards, that which you feel is beautiful or good or true, all this kind of implicit sense of life that we have, lean into it. Let it take you somewhere. Make sure that you're valuing it and not sidelining it. You're giving it the time. And that might be through practices, kind of, it might be prayer, meditative, contemplative kind of practices on the one hand, which is opening up to the divine presence coming to you through inspiration. But it can be in the Blake's very keen on what he calls the minute particulars. He thinks that it's by seeing a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, just when you walk past it in the morning, appreciating it, giving thanks for it. And those kind of practices can build. And whilst they may seem very slight in the moment, they kind of grow. And weeks and months down the line, you're living in a completely different world by these seemingly very modest practices. So the heart of it is trusting your heart in a way, trusting that which you feel is expansive, maybe in small ways. Again, there's nothing. It can sound a bit magical, and in a way, it is a bit magical. But the entry points are actually very humdrum. Blake, he writes a lot about kindness, for example. He thinks that when we're kind to someone, we actually step out of ourselves a bit and we share someone else's life a bit. He doesn't think we should be kind really for moral reasons, although clearly it's good to be kind to others. It's a spiritual practice for him being kind, because it takes us out of ourselves and we realize that we're sharing a life with someone else, and then that is expansive for us. We're sort of what he calls selfhood. We might call the ego or selfishness. We're putting that to one side and growing into something more. So yeah, it's in all these ways that you half know, I think, already, but just taking them that bit more seriously and realizing that they are the habits, the characteristics, the moments that lead into greater and greater truth.
It's interesting because I think, this finding the sacredness of small things and moments is something that it's almost like chicken and egg in the sense that if you're close to God, that's a fruit, that's a result of that. And yet at the same time, if you aren't close to God, or maybe you don't think you are, but you do focus on finding that sacredness, that will also lead you to God and bring you closer to God itself. And I know that I had an experience when, at a time in my life when I was very close to God, and I was a full time missionary, so my whole full time life was spent in service of God and in study and almost monk like in a way. And I remember one day I was having quite a hard week, and I saw a butterfly, and I was amazed by this butterfly and I pondered it. And I remember reflecting on it, thinking that was a bit silly of me to find a butterfly so amazing, being a grown man. But then I thought about it and thought, no, I'm actually really enjoying and seeing things in a different way. Like I'm really appreciating God's creations, and that in turn is helping me increase my faith more and more, and make my life, even in spite of challenges and difficult times, more meaningful. And so I definitely have resonated with that in the past.
The butterflies, it's a brilliant example, because actually Blake writes quite regularly about butterflies, and there's two elements of the butterfly that fascinated him. One is how the butterfly becomes a butterfly, and the life cycle of caterpillars and grubs, then the chrysalis pupa
Yes.
stage, which is this kind of complete meltdown of the earlier grub or caterpillar into this kind of mush, from which this extraordinarily beautiful creature erupts. For millennia, actually, that this has been a metaphor for dying and rising, or death and resurrection. And Blake draws it in that way too. But when you actually see a butterfly, you're present to this remarkable transformation. So it's a way in which, the imaginative moment, like you're suggesting, where you just see it fluttering by and you think that's beautiful. But then if you bring your mind, if you bring a bit of science to it, then that fluttering by becomes even more extraordinary, and you're showing more and more in the sort of depths of life. And then the other thing which Blake knew, which I always like as a nice detail, is that in Greek, um, the Greek for butterfly is the same as the Greek for soul, psyche. And I always love that.
Really?
I'm very keen on etymologies, because it's like, why was that connection made? Why was psyche meant both soul and butterfly? And again, if you open up yourself to that kind of, it's a bit of knowledge, if you like, but it's an imaginative entry point as well. Yeah. So look, butterflies are wonderful things.
I had no idea that that's what they were called in Greek. That's really interesting. I'm a fan of learning about etymology and things like that as well. Now, speaking about spiritual growth in this kind of segment, could you share with us the story of it's a very simple name, but Tell or Thel. I'm not sure. Thel. I'll just say it like that. And what we can learn about spiritual growth from that story in particular.
Yeah, so Thel is the
Thel.
kind of heroine of one of Blake's earlier poems. It's called the Book of Thel. It's actually quite, if you want to read a longer poem of Blake's, it's quite a good one to read. He writes these very short poems, which are quite well known actually, like Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, or, The Lamb. Um, One's about London. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. Those are shorter poems. But the Book of Thel is like a longer poem, and it's almost like a fairy story. It tells the story of a young girl who realizes that she's beginning to grow up, and she's rather terrified by that. She realizes that her childhood is going to come to an end, and it's going to be a challenging process to become an adult. And so she leaves her kind of paradise of youth and steps into the world. But she's has these encounters with various, not other human figures, but with like a cloud, or like a worm, or like a clod of earth. And these different parts of the natural world teach her something about her adult life, her pending adult life. So the cloud says, I enjoy the heights of the sky, but then in the heat of the day, I fall as a kind of dew on the ground, and I give my life to the ground beneath me. And Thel is like, I quite like the sky bit, and the warmth of the sun, but I'm not quite sure about this giving myself, for the sustenance of others. And then she talks to the clod of earth, even, and this very humble clod of earth. And the clod of earth says, "Yeah, I'm trampled on, but I give myself, I yield to the trampling, and so I make a soft bed for the lamb and the cow to walk over." So she's learning from these different parts of the natural world around her that really our life is discovered by giving it up, by giving it to others, by sharing what we have with others. That's the way that we find a kind of expansive appreciation of life. It's a very common theme in Blake. One of his best known quatrains that I love is, "He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise." And so Thel's having to learn this, this kind of lesson which you can, devote a whole life to, really, about how we grow in life by offering our life. And she learns it from the clouds, and she learns it from the clod of earth. At this moment, she finds it too much, actually. So Blake's always aware of the darkness, the struggle, the shadow. This is part of the Contraries. And she wants to rush back to her childhood paradise, and refuse the growing up. But there, she finds herself trapped, and what had been a paradise becomes a kind of prison. So in that particular poem, it has this sort of tragic ending. But of course, for we, the reader, the invitation is to find the courage to sort of step into this adult life, because we don't want to end up like Thel.
That's beautiful, and there's so many lessons to learn from that to be had. Now, turning tack again slightly, we've kind of going away from the core themes of the book, and I was just interested to learn a bit more about William Blake's faith himself. And there's this kind of he has no other Christianity. Um, what did Blake's Christian faith look like? Like you've described his relationship with Christ is almost, I think it was unusual but deeply sincere. And he criticized organized religion a lot as well. But what was his relationship with religion and with Christ?
So he's Christian, and actually, I think he's very orthodox in the sense of, the tradition of Christianity going back to Christ.
Right.
He believes very much in the incarnation. Um, Therefore, God becomes as we are, that we may be as God is. And this is a way of expressing Christianity that's much associated with mystical figures. He's contemporary with quite a few mystical figures, and perhaps the best known now is Charles Wesley, the founder of the Methodists. But he read figures like Teresa of Avila. He read the Church Fathers, as they're called, these very influential figures in the early Christian centuries. Um, and so I think that what he's doing is in the post-Reformation period, which is when, particularly in England, that mystical tradition, almost got sort of pulled out when Henry VIII closed down all the monasteries and religious houses. No doubt, partly they were corrupt and whatever needed reform and so on, but it was a very devastating blow, I think, to the spiritual life of England. And I think that's partly why we have these figures like Charles Wesley and William Blake and others, who are trying to revive that very felt participative notion of Christianity. He thought that's what Jesus shows us, that the relationship with which Christ had with the Father, we can have with the Father as well. But he's wary of organized religion. And I think the primary reason for that is because at the time, the Church of England had a kind of monopoly on civic life, you might say. To really be anything in life, you had to be a professing Anglican. So going to church was displaying your social status as much as anything else. And there are a number of figures at the time that criticise this. And Blake thought, partly because he's born into a dissenting family. So his mother was a Moravian, which was one of the minority Christian groups in London at the time. So he's not going to have a sort of natural sympathy with the Church of England, because the official religion of the time, the Anglican faith, often persecuted these dissenting traditions, actually. There was a lot of suspicion of Catholicism, for example, in England at the time. Blake lives through what are known as the Gordon riots, which was a kind of, I don't know, like a frenzy that seized the whole of London. And over a period of days and even weeks, loads of buildings were burnt down, and it ended up with hundreds of people being killed, actually. So, it was a time where religious fervor, could be very, very powerfully felt. So it's a serious business, your stance towards churches and how you're dealing with all this. It has sort of political consequences. And so Blake has this wariness of organized religion because of what he sees around him. But I think that it's a mistake to think, therefore, that he was some sort of heterodox Christian or, was a kind of loner. I think he's actually plugging very deeply into profound Christian traditions, and trying to foster their life again. So, it's one of the things which I want to say very much is that, he is, I think, quite an orthodox figure, but he has this vitality that, can be a bit surprising even at times. But when you feel into the life of it, it's very enlivening.
Really interesting. And well, something I was kind of, I don't think I fully understand yet is how he views Jesus. Because there are different quotes, like he's an embodiment of imagination. I think, is that right? And what what are we to take from Blake's Jesus and how he describes him and views him?
Yeah, so he spots something very interesting about Jesus, actually, which is that, as Blake puts it, I know of no other Christianity. As you said, that's one of my chapter titles, and that Christianity is the gospel of forgiveness. And Blake spotted, which is actually a true thing, that, and if you read like Plato and Aristotle, for example, you don't get any discussion of forgiveness. It just doesn't really occur to the pre-Christian mind. Whereas it seems that was core to the historical Jesus's teaching, a kind of forgiveness that is a sort of judgment, I think, but it's a judgment that liberates rather than a judgment that condemns. It's a kind of seeing yourself clearly and that being the first step towards growing more fully. Although the seeing yourself clearly can be very painful, of course, but there's always forgiveness there. Blake felt this is what he felt Jesus taught. But then Jesus is also a figure who lives still. Jesus appears very often in Blake's work, and typically he appears, he comes down, he arises, he's met in a friend or another figure. And when someone's at their lowest ebb, when they feel that all hope has gone, Jesus appears. And so I think that's another way in which he must have experienced Jesus, was as, in a way, that which is most trustworthy in life, but also perhaps the only thing that's truly trustworthy in life. We're perhaps inclined to trust ourselves or others, or our circumstance. And so part of Blake's Jesus is this person, this presence, this spirit who can always be trusted. We can always turn to, perhaps particularly in the hardest moments, because then we just can't trust anything else. So Jesus is that, but he's also the kind of Christ, the creative thread that runs through all things. So hence the imagination in Jesus, and being linked very much together for Blake. Jesus being, in a way, a historical figure who embodied the imaginative presence of God, bringing in the kingdom. Jesus was a figure who was in the world but not of the world, as St. Paul puts it, and that's very much part of our calling as well. Can we be Christ-like in that sense, by being open to the more, the cosmic presence of the divine, and so helping bring about the kingdom, and again, perhaps in quite small ways. So Jesus is an absolutely central figure, and at once is a teacher, forgiveness, at once is a presence, the figure who's there in our distress, but also is an inspiration and calling our humanity to reflect, in some measure at least, his humanity, which is also divine.
Such a fascinating way of looking at it. It's really interesting to hear and learn about. And well, I guess as an addendum to that, there are people that might say or think that Blake is a bit mad, and all of these visions of angels and spirits. And I'm a believer in personal revelation, and so I look at that and can see that aspect of it. But how do you feel we are to take these visions and things? I guess at the time maybe they were taken a bit differently to how different Christians would take them now. But what do you think we should take from them? And do you take them symbolically or literally in terms of his imagination and all of this view?
Yeah, I mean, I take them seriously, and I mean, I live just down the road from a place called Peckham Rye, and one of the famous stories about Blake when he was young was that he was walking one day on Peckham Rye and saw a tree full of angels bespangling every bough, as the person who wrote it down says. And I love when I go walking on Peckham Rye. It's a sort of, there's something quite funny about it, because Peckham Rye now is just like a big sort of part of suburban South London, and here's Blake, having seen angels in an oak or something. There's actually a pub called the Angel Oak, that remembers this,
Wow.
even on Peckham Rye. But I like it because there's something kind of fun about it, and I think that was important. There's a sort of wit to Blake about these things, but it's also a seriousness about it, that don't try and explain in such a way that you explain away these things. In the psychotherapy world, and often writers on Blake use a bit of psychology at this point and try and diagnose Blake. They say he had this condition or that, whatever. I say no. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to do, actually, because you just can't know. You can't diagnose someone from 200 years ago. And also, diagnoses are only really clusters of symptoms. They don't really tell you that much, and often anyway. But that aside, that's a whole discussion about psychology. But stay open to it. Blake, he knew about craziness. He had books about craziness. We know because we have some of the books of his that survive. And he knew that he was accused of being crazy as well, and he rebutted that. And it was a very important lesson for me when I used to work in a psychiatric hospital, and And there you meet people who have very sort of florid imaginations, but they're very closed as well. They're trapped by them. They're sort of on repeat. And that's part of the suffering that these people are gripped by. But Blake's imagination is expansive. You know, people want a taste of Blake. When they encounter an image of his, they feel something's been revealed to them. And I think that's absolutely key. And so, you know, when Blake said that he saw angels, I'm prepared to go with it and think, so how might I know at least something of that experience? You know, is it when I walk in a room and feel its light or feel that it's got a shadow? Is it when, you know, a moment of inspiration flashes through my mind? Why wouldn't that be a divine intelligence? And then I look at figures in the past who have written about angels, like, say, the great Christian theologians who said the angels were divine intelligences. Or I did my PhD on ancient Greek philosophy, actually, and particularly on Plato. And Socrates, Plato's great teacher, was accompanied by, they were called daemons at the time, but it was before daemons became demons. So daemons were really angels, and Socrates lived his life by this divine presence that informed him all the time. So I want to stay open to that. And I know some of the people that I trust the most, if you like, in history particularly, have attested to this kind of divine intelligent presence. You know, and so I'm going to stay open to that and see where it leads me. Blake says, I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall. And I want to hold onto that
Wow.
golden thread, you know, and see where it takes me.
What a great quote. I mean, there are so many. I mean, that's why he's amazing, right? So many of these. Speaking of that, how has writing this book shaped your faith or changed you?
Yeah, he's a challenging person to write about, Blake,
Yeah.
because he's one of these figures that you realize is your engagement with them is kind of forming you, and you can only really write about them insofar as not you've understood them in an academic sense, but you've understood them because in some way or other you share the life that they're talking about. And the more you sort of spend time with Blake, the more you realize you're being formed by him. I mean, that way of just talking about angels is a case in point, actually. You know, I really wanted to have a chapter on angels in the book because it was such a key part of Blake's life. It's not just like a little detail. Um, Everybody attested to the fact that he saw angels and other celestial beings of one sort or another. He writes about it very often. He's quite witty about it. He's quite insightful about it. Um, so, you know, I didn't want to just to sort of explain that and explain it away. But then, you know, that's quite challenging. So I'm going to put words, pen to paper, if you like, and put, you know, myself on the line a bit writing about this. And you know, so that sort of challenge and courage is one of the ways that I feel changed by having written this book. I mean, I'm Christian and I'm very interested in mystical Christianity. That was very much part of why I was drawn to Blake. I feel that we need these individuals who can bring that whole tradition back to life. Partly because of my work as a psychotherapist, but generally in society as well. And so again, it's all very well to say, you know, I have a private faith or I'm drawn to the inner life of the mystic. But what difference does that make? How does this affect our society, our politics, the way we experience the world? And so, you know, the book is me trying to follow those threads as well and try and say something about that, which I feel is part of the way that I've been changed by it too.
Is there a single line or moment of Blake's work that speaks most powerfully to you on a spiritual level?
Yeah, well, the quatrain which I cited earlier actually struck me at a very particular moment in my life. So this is the quatrain: "He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise." And I heard this when I was actually going through my own therapy. I had quite a traditional period of psychotherapy, went, you know, several times a week for quite a number of years, and it was very good at opening up to me what had sort of gone wrong in my earlier life, and it caused me quite a lot of trouble. But I felt quite stuck. after a period of time, and I didn't really know quite where to go with this. I couldn't sort of feel my way forward. Um, I felt I was getting to know more and more about myself, but I was still, sort of lost within myself. And then I heard this quatrain, and at first I didn't know what it meant at all, but I just knew that it was carrying a spirit that was really important. And I wrote it down and I kept repeating it. And it seemed to bring in a kind of light and a possibility that was part of me just slowly, slowly over, months really, and even years still now, finding that there is a way in which life can be shared in by letting yourself go more and more, bringing all that you have, but kind of offering it rather than trying to secure it and pin it down and control things, which have been, well, it's still a big habit of mine, to be frank, but nonetheless, I hope not quite so dominating as it was at one point.
Thanks for sharing that. And this has been so exciting. I've really loved this discussion. I've taken so much away, and I'm just excited to dive into more William Blake after this. But um, obviously, most of our listeners will be people of faith, and maybe perhaps unsure what to make of poetry or mysticism playing a role in their faith. We the faith can be very pragmatic at times, and doing my church responsibilities and doing this, and making sure I'm reading my scriptures every day and praying. you know um what would you say Blake could offer them, and your book could offer them?
I think he's a fellow Christian, but because of the way that he can write about these things in a distinctive way, he can create a kind of resonance or a harmony, even a sort of contrary. Even if you read something, you think, I don't know what that means, and I'm not sure I kind of agree. But he is coming from a place of faith. You can always be sure about that, and therefore, by engaging with him from maybe these oblique perspectives, maybe the beauty of the line, the strikingness of the image, um, that then refreshes your usual habits, your usual practices. It brings in a new life. It's not being told what you know in the ways that you've always been told, there's a place for that. It's good to feel your house is built on stone and so on, not on sand. Um, but there's also, I think, a place for a kind of the unexpected and a different perspective. Someone who kind of catches you unawares, and that can be the spirit speaking as well. And I think Blake's brilliant for that, because he's so distinctive. The minute you see a Blake image once, you immediately recognise other Blake images. And he does very often, very directly engage with biblical stories, for example. He painted dozens and dozens of images from the Gospels, but there's always a bit of a twist. There's always a detail that makes you think, now that's not quite what's in the Bible, but it's kind of resonating with what's in the Bible and opening up therefore something. He thought that Scripture needs to be a living text. It's when your spirit meets the spirit in the text that actually the meaning is released. So he's brilliant, I think, at that kind of expansive um, presence in your life of faith.
Thank you. And I think a great place for everyone to start is with your book, Awake. And where can people get that? And where can people who love what you're saying and the way you've delivered it and all of that after this keep up to date with your work as well?
Yeah, well, look, thank you. I appreciate the time and the pleasure in sharing these things. And I have a website, markvernon.com, and I try and sort of pool everything there, but do podcasts and stuff on YouTube and talks. And the book, you can find it online. You should be able to find it in the US from the 1st of September 2025. It's already out in the UK, but I hope it will be widely available, in fact.
Yes, well, I'll be linking all of it below, and I'll be off afterwards, like many others, I'm sure, to go and watch other videos of yours and content. I know I'm a big fan of Ian McGilchrist, and I saw that you've done a conversation with him. So on William Blake. So I'm going to be off to watch that this evening. And thank you so much, Mark. This has been so much fun.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for holding the space. And I hope that people who've been listening have felt some of the enthusiasm that we've been sharing. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for watching For All the Saints. This show needs your help to grow. Please like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you think would enjoy it. Thank you.